To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by my guest, Martin J. in Marrakesh. He's an award-winning journalist and commentator. And here in Moscow, we have Maxim Suchkov. He is the director of the Center for Advanced American Studies at Moscow Institute of International Relations. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Let's go to Martin J. in Marrakesh. What do you think of the foreign minister's words? Because she's gotten a lot of pushback for it, and it's called a gaffe, but we all know a gaffe is when someone tells the truth. It's not when they make a mistake. So she knew exactly what she was doing. I would even go further, is that she may be making a play to become chancellor to push out Schultz. Anyway, Martin, your thoughts?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think it's really interesting that Germany is so confused about the war. It just jumps from one camp to another. It started, if you remember, Schultz being very defiant and saying he wouldn't get involved, and sent a couple of containers of helmets to the Ukrainian army, which we all mocked and made fun of on the internet. But it does say a lot about Western democracy when a minister who just speaks the truth basically gets shot down. Forgive the metaphor, and people are asking for her to resign. I think that says an awful lot about where we are today with the truth and fiction. I always say the American war machine, or the American war business, because it is a business, wherever it goes in the world, it always has three doctrines: oversimplification, polarization, and disinformation. And I think the story now about Germany and the war, and this whole story about tanks, which is emerging, really, fits this narrative completely. I think we're in a position now where it seems to me that the war of attrition that we've spoken about for so many days on this program is over. It seems to me that Western elites, particularly European governments, are almost pleading with their electorates, look, give us 6 more months. That's all we need. We just need 6 more months, because, the media have been thrown this bone with a lot of meat on it, tanks. It's a great subject. The war has died down a bit because of the winter, so journalists need raw material to get their teeth into. We're going to see a lot of tank stories in the press in the next couple of months. And the media is going to obsess over the subject of this war is all about tanks. It's a single subject. It's a silver bullet. 6 months ago it was artillery. And now it's tanks. But I think tanks and the initiative from Germany. Finally, Schultz, who gave in, he's so weak. It's unbelievable how pathetic he is. Don't compare him to Hitler. Hitler was a strong leader. Schultz is completely weak. He's totally the opposite. But I think this story about tanks just raises the level higher from the height that you fall. What will we do? What will those elites do with the people who vote for them in 6 months' time when the tanks story isn't working for them, and they're being blown up, and people are starting to ask really questions. Well, how much are these tanks costing? Because in the UK now, pensioners are dying in their apartments. They're actually dying from hypothermia because they haven't got the money to put it into the gas meter, to heat themselves. And I think this is really part of the panic now that's setting in. We can't believe two stories. On the one hand, we were told that Western governments backing the Ukrainian forces were basically winning. Look at this ground that they've taken. But now, even Biden has been pulled into the tanks. Let's call it a black hole, because it really is a black hole to fall into. He's been,
Martin, let me go to Max here, because this focus on the tanks, for me, it's just a metaphor, okay? 30, 40, 50 tanks are not going to move the needle one way or another. As a matter of fact, it'll end up being quite humiliating, considering Russia's eyes in the sky. And I've been following on Telegram a few channels that show actually a very graphic video of the conflict. Watching those Abrams tanks melt is not going to be a good public relations spin. And I think they know that. We're going to send tanks, but they're not going to send them for a long time, okay? Max, because for me, it's more about the escalation ladder. This morning, I'm seeing reports that, now that we got the tanks out of the way, now I'm going to talk about F-16s, okay? This is the escalation, and Martin's absolutely right. It's a way to keep the Western publics interested, okay? Because I remember the lead up to the Iraq War, CNN just went graphics crazy. They never show any real destruction. They just show all these cool graphics, and that's what they're doing all over again, because this is an elite agenda. and they're trying desperately to get the public on board, and that's waning. Max, go ahead.
Well, I agree. It's about escalation ladder. I also think it's about a certain shift in the resolve. We've heard today or yesterday one of the top NATO officials claiming that NATO is prepared for the war with Russia, which I think is an outcome of an assessment of NATO officers of their view of how Russia performs. But the matter of fact is that even though Russia has lost a significant number of conventional forces, the things that will most probably, God forbid, get involved in conflict with NATO has not been tackled, such as, nuclear arms, strategic aviation, other strategic arms, and things like this. So, and this is one of the, outcomes of this kind of wrong reading of the military history. My colleague brought up Hitler, and I have to say that Hitler misread the outcome of the Soviet-Finnish war, where the Soviets lost, and he thought that the Soviets were too weak and that could be tackled. So, and I think right now NATO may be reading the lines wrongly here, and they believe that if they pour more arms into Ukraine, Russia will suffer even more higher a blowback, and they will be dealt with easily. And I also would put it in a larger context and point to recent attack on Iran and rising escalation to China, which here in Moscow is read as part of the kind of Western strategy to go after the adversaries that have been put out there, Russia, China, and Iran as kind of part of the quote unquote vicious axis of evil, new axis of evil. And that all is incredibly dangerous, and is, even if in the spring of last year, the U.S. in particular, the West in general, have pursued the strategy of the so-called boil and frog strategy, where they will, put up the heat gradually. Now they see this strategy hasn't really working, and Russia is still there, and is able to put up a fight. And they're, I think, in dire need, because, as my colleague mentioned correctly, in my view, the war of attrition has not really bore any positive fruit for the Western elites. So they're escalating much more quicker than they used to, with the tanks, with aviation and stuff, which unfortunately I think brings us even closer to the brink of a larger escalation and a much bigger war.
That's probably the intent here. One thing I'd like to point out to both of you, Betterbox comments, as foolish as they were, that divided the West more. She's a divisive figure, but the same statement that she made unified Russians, because that was all over Russian television. See, they even said it. They're at war with us. Okay, we didn't want to go to war with them, but they're at war with us. I mean, it's really quite amazing how a slip of the tongue, so-called, can be used in a very different way, which nobody in Western media has even deigned to even comment on. Martin, okay. Another thing here. I mean, I just said, this escalation ladder. The problem with NATO and its mindset. I don't know what military thinkers they really have, because NATO's entire existence, it was most effective when it didn't do anything. That was our childhood, Martin. Okay, they didn't do anything; they were just there. Okay, but they crushed Serbia through air power. Serbia had no air power to respond. Okay, I don't even need to talk about the adventures in the Middle East. Goat herders with Kalashnikovs. Russia is not a goat herder with a Kalashnikov. Okay, it has eyes in the sky, very sophisticated aviation and aeronautics. Okay, NATO's never confronted this before, because they never expected that they would. But they, through their own inability to think strategically about the Eurasian landmass, they have found themselves in this. This, again, is just more loose talk. I can't imagine they want to send F-16s to have them shot down. How many F-16s were shot down in Afghanistan? How many F-16s were shot down in Iraq? They will be shot down over Ukraine. Martin.
Yeah, and they're pretty expensive as well. And that's another issue that we should look at, is that the money cannot continue. It just can't go on forever. F-16s are what? 60 million a pop. You know, you can't sort of just write them off like that. It's interesting that you draw up this unsavory parallel with goat herders and AKs. It makes me think of Idlib a few years ago, where the Turkish army used Leopard 2 tanks in a particular town and got surprised by the unwashed jihadists with their rusty AKs who managed to blow up 10 of them. So it's an indication, and NATO should probably learn from that experience that these tanks are very capable and they're very advanced. And I think if we just look at the bullet points on paper, they seem to be better than the Russian tanks. However, Ukraine is massive, and we know from the Idlib experience that these tanks won't operate very well in urban environments. So you're only looking at the countryside. Does that mean that then Russia focuses the war exclusively on the cities, and the Ukraine will then have to be forced to make the decision: do we send the tanks into these cities and risk huge losses? I think the tank story is a bit of a fantasy, and a lot of fake news has come with it. And I think NATO really, you talk about NATO and its role, and NATO really is about fake news. And I don't know how long that narrative can continue before people start, getting a bit tired of it.
That's the whole point. I mean, is that I've always said this is that it's just the propaganda arm of the of U.S. foreign policy in Europe. Okay, and then they began to believe their own propaganda about themselves. Russia wouldn't take on NATO. Oh my God! You've told them they are at war with them. Let me go to Maxim here. I mean, from the Russian perspective, I mean, there's it's a military alliance, but what is it really made of? I mean, everybody's cobbling together these little outdated tanks, or the Belgians sell things that don't work for them, so let's give it to Ukraine. I mean, it's so embarrassing, considering their highfalutin rhetoric all the time based on values. But it's not backed up by much, is it? Go ahead, Matt.
Well, I think what another story that I think is overlooked right now in the West is that the Russian reading of this pressure over Germany to supply tanks is very much put in the context of kind of Anglo-Saxon geopolitics that has always pursued the idea to drive a wedge between the Germans and Russia in Europe. And you see the American discourse and narrative on the need for the Germany to supply tanks to Ukraine, where on the one hand, Americans are criticizing Germany for its impotence. They're saying, the German soldier is a civilian in a uniform, and Germany has been so lazy staying under the American umbrella, so they have to learn how to take care of their own security. And on the other hand, what they're doing is exactly linking Germany to U.S. military umbrella to an even greater extent.
Max, I have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Let's go back to Max in Moscow. Just before we went to the break, you were trying to make a second point. Go right ahead.
I was going to say that by making Germany give up their tanks to Ukrainians, the winner is clearly American military-industrial complex that will be now producing even more American tanks that will substitute the German ones, that will ultimately make Germany and the rest of Europe even more dependent on U.S. military supplies and military assistance and military infrastructure. Whether this was the intent to feed the military-industrial complex, that makes sense. But strategically, I think it may turn out as a mistake, as the U.S. is trying to focus more on China, and then that it will have to, keep a lot more resources in Europe again.
Yeah, Martin, it just with the old adage, when NATO was established, keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. That hasn't changed very much here. I mean, it's really interesting. I think both of you are on the right track here. Twisting Germany's arm over tanks, what few they actually have. And I've been told by a lot of people that they don't really work very well. I mean, Germany hasn't been in this business for a long time, and that's a good thing, okay? But the forcing them yield to their will. That's what this is about. It's not about tanks, okay? They're blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines. That's another shot across the bow to Germany. That Germany will have a breach with Russia forever. There is no turning back here. You're not going to have an energy relationship with them. We're going to tell you what to do with your military. We will determine what your national security interests are. And they're getting away with it. They're actually succeeding. It's really quite amazing. I don't know how that's good for European security, which I doubt it is. Go ahead, Martin.
I don't know what's good for European security, but when we look at we go back to the beginning of the Ukraine war, what was, I think, prolifically worrying for many Western leaders was the rise of Germany's ability to rearm itself. The idea that Germany rearms itself to protect Europe is kind of hilarious if you think about it, and that's what, Schultz took that precedent. He took that moment to take advantage of the situation in the Ukraine war to rearm Germany for the first time. And I think that's quite worrying in its own. But what's also worrying,
I agree with you, but if I could just interrupt here. I mean, I've spent time in Germany during my entire adult life, many times. Very interesting country. I don't. Where are they getting into soldiers? Nobody wants to join the military. It's just not. Unless they get immigrants, which is something that could be very possible. I've always found it really interesting how Germany wants to have like Moldova in NATO, because they'll be the troops for NATO. Germans don't want to do it. French don't want to do it. Italians don't want to do it. Okay,
yeah, don't forget
the umbrella of Germany being under the umbrella of the United States. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
You've also got to remember that the whole tank story is a logistical nightmare. I mean, I'm reading that the Ukrainians reckon that the soldiers can be trained in 10 weeks to man a crew. Even if that's true, I mean, the Americans always talk about 20-week program for the Abrahams, but even if it's true, what sort of chance are they going to stand as being completely wet behind the ears going to battle against the experienced tank commanders on the Russian side? So I think the tanks is a fake news story, and I think we're going to see more of that. But what's worrying is Germany rearming itself, NATO being put in this position where the next really big decision that NATO will have to make a decision on is the most worrying one, which scares the hell out of me, which is that how do we crank this war up to the next level and keep the momentum going, keep media on our side, keep voters on our side? What worries me is that if these tanks have any impact, and they won't have any impact when you're talking about numbers of 30 or 40, but the hope is in something like 12 months' time, you might get to 200 to 300. If they start to have an impact against Russian forces, that puts Putin in a position where we are so horrified to think of what he can do next. Because if he's pushed in a position where he has to defend the Russian army against these onslaughts, then I think the next level is possibly air assault. Now, Putin has for a long time has pulled back from sending the Air Force into Ukraine. His enemies claim that's because he doesn't want to showcase the SU range of fighter jets, because if a couple of SUs get shot down, that's really bad for business. There's some truth in that, I guess. But I think Putin is much, much more responsible. He's much more obsessed with keeping us away from the bigger option, the real war against NATO. He doesn't want nuclear option. He doesn't want an airstrikes. He doesn't want an air force war in Ukraine, because that just takes NATO to, it takes the whole thing to such a dangerous level. And that will be the decision for NATO is, if tanks aren't working, then what's the next level after that?
I think because it's already been discussed, Max, is the issue of supplying long-range weaponry to the Ukrainians to attack Crimea. That's, I think, the next step here. Okay, and that's obviously a step in the escalation ladder here. What I find interesting about it is I don't know how meaningful the intent is. What they're doing is they're testing the waters to see what Russia's reaction would be, because it's putting, because Russia deems it is part of its sovereign territory. They've made it very clear that they will use whatever means necessary to protect their sovereignty. Obviously, we all know where this is going. It's kind of like, it's a very, very real life game of chicken here, Max.
Well, I think the Crimea story is indeed a big part of it, till way down the road, perhaps in the spring, because it would take a lot more military personnel and capabilities to try to seize it. And there are, for now, I think we've seen severe, losses of Ukrainian military on different parts of the front. What I find remarkable, as you mentioned, this tank story, Peter, is right now we have kind of two realities going in parallel. On the one hand, you have this kind of media reality where the Western allies are trying to concoct this narrative that that they're supplying Ukraine with a lot of tanks, that Russia loss is imminent, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, you have the reality which is a lot more complicated and composed of logistical issues, political issues, financial issues. That makes all the supplies a lot more difficult. That makes all the training a lot more longer. And they're talking about months. That we see the situation on the front line is changing so quickly. Even a couple of months may be a game changer, and the tanks may arrive at the time where they're not needed, or they will not be able to help Ukraine, or let alone the aviation. So I think that's part of the reason we see NATO commanders and some of the Western politicians making this harsh comments and trying to jump, not just go up the ladder of escalation, or jump up the ladder of escalation, which is very dangerous, of course.
Yeah, Martin, also over the last few news cycles, we had the flurry of stories of Zelensky shaking up the political system in Ukraine. And it's always about corruption. Way before this conflict started, it was always about corruption. And unfortunately, I'm sure a lot of Westerners are really going to the bank on this one too. I call it the Hunter Biden paradigm. But it's really interesting to me is that that we're cleaning up corruption and all that. Well, it seems to me that what happened there is that so many greedy. There's so many greedy people around Zelensky that people want a greater cut. It's really very much like The Sopranos. Okay, I mean, I'm going to get my cut, and I've cut this guy out, and because there's this funnel of money constantly coming in, people are seeing it, and I tend to think, and this is one of the reasons why I think that the kind of criminal mindset of the Zelensky regime is that they know this thing is going to be up. Is it going to be a month, a few months, a year? But they want their cut before it's cut off, okay? And the tank story kind of covered, kind of pushed the corruption thing. Nobody really wants to talk about it. Though, right the day before the special military operation, Ukraine's a corrupt country. That's what most people knew. Now, we've seen over the last 11 months how narratives can easily change. Martin.
Yeah, they do. They do change a lot. But I think the whole corruption story is funny. This thing about this purge of getting rid of these so-called corrupt officials that Zelensky did, he did that just immediately a few weeks after coming back from America, where he went with the begging bowl and managed to pull a blinder and get the Republicans to sign up the deal in Congress to unleash something like 25 billion in military aid alone. So I mean, that's really what it was all about. But let's not forget that Ukraine's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And, this tank story may well be part of that. It'll be interesting to see, how the Pentagon keeps this straight face, how my own government, British government, keeps this straight face and says to journalists, look, we can't track these tanks. We don't have the technology. We can't put tiny little chips in them and check that they're actually in Ukraine. BS.
Why can't they do that?
They do track them.
Smartphones, they can't do it with a tank?
Exactly. They do track them, but they don't want people to know that, because if the general public say, well, okay, you're tracking them, can you show us on the internet where they are? Can you confirm at least that they're in Ukraine? That's the issue here. So corruption on both sides is a really big issue, but we should never forget, I'm always talking about the bigger war on your show. I'm always talking about the war beyond Ukraine. We haven't talked about that today, but that, Africa, I said to you on December the 28th, look at the African countries and look how many are falling. They're no longer staying as French vassals. becoming now part of the Russian fold. I said to you on December 28th, watch Burkina Faso. It's wobbling, just like Mali fell in August of last year. Burkina Faso is about to fall. It's kicked out already the French military. And I think Africa will be a story which we should follow, because more of these countries are falling now in line with either being non-aligned or going the full 9 yards and becoming part of Russia's influence in the region and signing up for BRICS. So, let's not obsess too much about tanks. Tanks may well blow up in the face of the West, forgive the pun. I mean, I'm expecting that already. But how far can they go, really? I mean, I think a lot has been made of this story, and the German press now are having a field day with this particular minister. But I see more division, and I see the tank story as a rod for the West's own back.
Unfortunately, gentlemen, we've run out of time here. I want to thank my guests in Marrakesh and here in Moscow.